For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Philosopher Daniel Dennett described the theory of evolution as the single best idea that anyone has ever had. Now, I can see some people in front. If I cover this, I can see some more people, right? But I'm already starting to see some reactions. I saw something like this. I saw some people sitting a bit farther back. I saw some people lean forward. Now, why is something like this, a claim such as this, the cause of such emotion inside of people? Because I want to let you know that you're not alone. At least in the United States, this is results from Gallup, the most recent ones we have from 2014, and they extend all the way back to the 1980s. As you can see, a little bit over 40% of people believe in something called creationism. Now, creationism is the thought that the world was created by God and no evolution has occurred. Now, if you look under that, you'll see that a little above 30% believe in what's called something like theistic evolution. That is the thought that evolution happened, but God was somehow involved. If you look right under that, that is called naturalistic evolution, which means evolution happened, but God was not involved. And the interesting thing about this is that this graph only goes up till the 1980s. But as you can see, not much has changed from then to now. And in fact, if you trace it all the way back, you'll see that the controversy is a little bit longer, or longer lived, than you would imagine. So I want to take a bit of a step back. You all might know this person. This is Charles Darwin, and this is how most people recognize him, right? Old, wise, scraggly beard, always pensive. But the person that most people don't know is Emma Darwin. She was Charles Darwin's wife, and to be able to fully appreciate what they meant to one another, right at this point in their lives, and when they first met, we have to go back a little bit farther. We got to make them a little bit more relatable to the everyday. So let's take that journey really quick. You can see them here in all of their glory. This is right after they got married. These were sort of commemorative paintings that they had made. You can see that they're young, happy, and it looks like in love, right? Well, the incredible thing was that probably a decade after these paintings were painted, Charles Darwin would be publishing On the Origin of Species. And that was a book that as soon as it landed, it caused an incredible amount of controversy. They had to haggle with their own beliefs. Charles Darwin, a little bit before this time, he was studying theology. He was going to be an Anglican clergyman. And Emma Darwin, or who would be Emma Darwin, she was actually a Unitarian. For her, the idea of religion was more akin to the life that you led and who you loved, and the fact that the person that you loved would be with you for all of eternity. So you could imagine what a book like On the Origin of Species did to the world and to their relationship. They were attacked by members of every camp, religious, scientific, and the common people. The book was taken and interpreted in a bunch of different ways. But they had a secret because they made it. They made it to old age until death did them part. So the question is, what was their secret to weathering this storm? And to understand this, we're going to have to take a step forward to the recent past, for me at least. Now, that's my roommate. You can see that the relationship is a bit different, but it's still kind of one-sided. But anyway, he was my roommate freshman year at college. And I just flew over there from Puerto Rico. And I was fresh, a bunch of ideas, really happy to do stuff. And as soon as I got there, I realized, and so did my parents who are in the audience, that he had certain philosophical ideas that were very different from my own, right? So we were wondering, well, this is going to be fun. And as soon as I spent the first night at the dorms, I was supposed to sleep, but I didn't, because him and I stayed up talking essentially all night. It was a fierce amount of philosophy and friendly banter about everyone's beliefs, thoughts, and their past. It was an incredibly eye-opening experience for me, and I would like to think for him as well. I learned a lot, and I took that with me. And then if we fast forward a little bit, my senior year at my university, I decided that I wanted to take what had been done with him, what we had done together, and sort of expand it a little bit. So in comes my short documentary. I decided that I wanted to take a group of random strangers, except two of them knew each other, but I essentially went out and found people. And I would hike up a mountain with these people and film them as they talked about their beliefs. And I thought, who better to moderate this discussion than probably the most unbiased person I know? So I contacted him, my ex-roommate at this point, and he said, sure, I'll do it. So together, we went up to a mountaintop with 6 other people, and he moderated this talk. And it was fantastic. They were up there for 3 hours, and the hike up was approximately an hour and a half. So these strangers that didn't know each other at all had an hour and a half to essentially talk to each other, get to know each other enough, and then talk about probably one of the most controversial things ever. And it's really interesting because I would like to think that these people found out Charles and Emma Darwin's secret. So that brings us right back to both of them. What was Charles and Emma Darwin's secret? It was talking. Now, okay, no, you're all laughing. Okay, wait. let me take a step back. Chill. So, you're all probably thinking right now, did this guy just spend 7.5 minutes telling us a story about this crazy secret, and the secret is talking? The answer is yes, but hold up, okay? All right, please, bear with me. So, let me explain. A lot of people claim to be able to talk to each other. They claim to be able to dialogue. They claim to be able to exchange ideas freely. But the problem comes when I put a quote like what I did in the beginning up. As soon as I did that, the majority of you immediately flooded your minds with thoughts, preconceived notions, vitriol, everything. Your past was just coming to attack you at that moment. Some of you were going like, I wonder what he's going to say. Others were like, yeah, kill him. Other people were going like, oh my God, this is going to be really crazy. Some other people were going like, oh man, I want to leave right now. This is a stupid talk. Other people are going like, oh no, I hope he doesn't upend any of my beliefs. There is no God. What I'm saying is, before any of those thoughts, past transgressions, beliefs, ideas, ideals, and personal philosophies come into play, I urge all of you to take a step back. Take a step back and recognize that that's all happening, and that you're making up your mind before you've even heard what the person has to say. It's not about what you believe. It's about why you believe it. Where do you come from? Where have you been? The fact of the matter is that the biggest ideas, such as the theory of evolution, often have effects at the smallest, most imperceptible scales, interpersonal relationships inside of your mind. And sometimes, the most insignificant thing that you just throw aside, talking, communication, dialogue, sometimes that is the biggest idea that we have. And all of the people that were involved, all of these 6 strangers who were everywhere on the gradient of evolution and creationism, they all found that out. In fact, one of them even came up to me afterwards and said, I can't believe I didn't want to punch anyone in the face. Hey, it's 3 hours. I mean, what can you do? So, now that I've said that, I want to leave you all with a quote. This comes from Emma Darwin writing to Charles Darwin. They not only communicated in person, but they also communicated through letters when Darwin was out and about, which he was a lot. And it goes a little something like this, so take it with you wherever you go. I thank you from my heart for your openness with me, and I should dread the feeling that you were concealing your opinions from the fear of giving me pain. My own dear Charlie, we now do belong to each other, and I cannot help being open with you. By the way, in case you haven't noticed, I haven't said where on the gradient of evolution and creationism I stand. Doesn't matter. Thank you.
Dr. Carter, always love it when you're our guest. You do a great job for us. What are we going to talk about today?
We're going to look at our origins with Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And then the genetic effects of Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel.
All right. Well, that's fascinating. Will you go to the board and help us?
All right. In any study, scientific study using the Bible as a basis, we have to acknowledge that the Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. And so just starting with that as an assumption, let's see if this history actually fits what we've discovered in human genetics over the last couple of decades. The Bible specifically claims that God created all things in 6 days and created people on the 6th day of creation, but it only started with 2 people, Adam and Eve. Genesis 2:7, then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Notice there's no evolutionary history of mankind here. We didn't evolve from monkeys. We were created specifically by God.
By God, made Adam.
But where does the woman come from? Well, the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man. And while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up his place with flesh. And the rib the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. So we started with 2 people.
One man and one woman.
That is a profound statement about genetics right there.
Okay.
Because that influences the way people should look today if we only started with 2 people. But about 1,600 years later, something happened. The whole world population was reduced to 8 people at the time of Noah's flood. Now, if you just add up the ages given to us in the Bible, Noah was born about 1,056 years after creation, or Anno Mundi, year of the world.
Okay, the year the world was made.
Yeah, it's a neat way to date things. The Bible says in Genesis 7, Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came upon the earth. So Noah's flood was about 1600 a.m. I rounded off.
Yeah.
So the question we have is, how many people could have been on the earth after 1600 years? That's going to influence the genetics of the people after the flood.
Starting with 2.
Starting with 2, how many could you possibly get? Well, since we don't know how far apart the children are, or how many children on average per couple, or how old the women are when they stop having children, all these things we don't know. A friend and I, we actually published this in our Journal of Creation a couple of years ago. We wrote a massive computer program. It's a population modeling program. We threw all those parameters in there, including the rate of twins being born and whether or not there's polygamy in the society. And all those things have a little effect. And each of these bars is the result of 100 computer runs. That's the average. Now, depending on how far apart the children are and how young the women start having children, we showed that some population can go extinct.
Yeah.
And some populations can grow at up to 8%. Now, in 8% population growth, the population doubles every 9 years.
Oh, okay.
So that's a
Just 8%
massive population. So now, how fast did it grow? I don't know. But somewhere in that range. Even with slow growth, slow growing populations, we got thousands of people in just a couple of hundred years after creation. Now these 3 curves, this is how old the woman is when they start having children. So if they wait until they're 80 years old, so Adam and Eve's first daughter has to be 80 years old before she has her first child. Even with that delay, we've got about 8,000 people after about 400 years.
Huh.
So how many people at the flood? It could have been millions. I suspect from the genetics that it wasn't. I think it was much smaller than that, but the possibility for a massive population is there. My best guess would be hundreds to thousands of people at the flood. And then Noah's family was picked from that group.
All right.
Genesis chapter 9 gives us another statement about genetics. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Well, the Bible says there that all people on earth came from 3 couples. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 sons. That's a profound statement. Is that possible just 4,500 years ago? Actually, yeah. But there's one more thing that happens with human genetics in the Bible. And that's the Tower of Babel event, where a couple of generations after the flood, the people are already acting wickedly. So the Lord dispersed them from there, that's Babel, over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. When did that happen? That's a great question. Well, in Genesis chapter 10, it says, to Eber, descendant of Shem, to Eber were born 2 sons. The name one was Peleg. For in his day the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Now, people debate over what this division means. Some people say that was continental drift. No. Some people say, oh no, that was the land flooded, and therefore people got divided. I don't think so. The context here is the Tower of Babel.
Okay.
So the context of the Tower of Babel happened during the life of Peleg. And adding up the ages from Shem to Eber to Peleg, if you add up all these ages, you get between 101, and that's when Peleg was born about, nominally, and 340 years, that's when he died. That's when the Tower of Babel should have happened. A couple of centuries after the flood.
Okay.
Now, how many people could have been alive then? Well, remember that last slide? The slide a couple slides ago when I showed those curves going upwards? You could easily have had thousands of people at the Tower of Babel. Looking at the potential growth rate of human populations, we can actually ask the question, how come there are only 7 billion people?
Yeah. Oh.
And my answer is, most people ever born died of starvation, disease, or warfare.
Wow.
because the population could have grown much, much, much faster than it actually did. There's another interesting genetic thing, and that is the Exodus. So the Bible says that 70 people went to Egypt. But Exodus 12 says that about 600,000 fighting males left Egypt. And if you have 600,000 fighting age men, your population, you have to have about the same number of women plus old people plus young people. The population, some people estimate, somewhere around 2.7 million Hebrews left Egypt. Wow. Can you go from 70 to 2.7 million in 480 years?
Can you?
What do you think?
I think we did.
I think we did, but that's a big difference, isn't it?
Sure is.
Oh, okay, well, let's look at this. First of all, in that same computer model, we started with 70 people, and in this case, we're saying the children are 1 year apart, 2 year apart, 3, 4, or 5 years apart on average. Not that every woman always had a child every 1 year, but at the minimum, that was our setting for our model. And what we showed then over 480 years, every single model we ran had more than our required 2.7 million people. So it's easy to get that number of Hebrews in 480 years, starting from 70 people.
Very doable.
Now, granted, that's ridiculous. Right? These numbers, that's not a number. That's not possible. But this is possible. The land can't hold that many people, it can't hold that many, and you can get that big in that much time. But some scholars believe that the sojourn was only 215 years long. Fine. Well, we ran that model also. And after 215 years, a number of our computer models had more than that 2.7 million people that are required. And the answer is all you have to do is have children spaced very closely together. That's very interesting stuff. And it's just really fun to apply computer models to genetics and biblical history just to see what we could do. Now, I stole this from a government website, and it's their fault, it's not the best picture in the world, but they're saying here that this is the population size over time, going all the way back to, they believe, way before the Bible says the world was created. But essentially, there's about 1 million people alive across the world for tens of thousands of years, and all of a sudden, somebody invents farming. And that means that extra population can be handled because there's more food. And all of a sudden, the population does that, and we have 7 billion people today.
So food is, you can see how food is integral to living. So it's basically survival mode for thousands of years.
Yeah, but did this really exist?
No.
And how come the people with the same genes back here, who were just as smart as people here, they didn't think of planting something in the ground and harvesting it the next year? So this is really magic back here.
Right.
Taking that thought, I applied that to a biblical idea where this is the flood, this is today. And starting from those 6 people, all you have to do is double the number of people every 156 years, and you arrive at 7 billion people after 4,500 years. That's a growth rate of 0.4%. Remember, so some of my models had 8% growth rate. Now, it's ridiculous. Populations don't grow that fast, but they could, theoretically. But that is incredibly slow. And in fact, just about any model that has any growth at all, you can get this many people in those many years. So the human population size actually is a biblical human population size. If evolution was true and we existed for so many thousands of years before that, there should be trillions of people. Not that it's possible.
Yeah.
Or someone should have invented farming earlier than that. or another way to ask it is this. If 1 million people live for about 1 million years, where are the trillions of bodies?
That's a really good question.
They don't exist.
There's no bones down there.
Yeah, there are some ancient bones we found, great, but those are post-flood people. Right. There should be millions upon millions of cemeteries, old villages, and remains of people, and we don't find them. I believe it's because they didn't exist. Now, looking at the Adam and Eve story, we can make some predictions. First, if we only started with 2 people, all the people today should have a low genetic diversity. If we started with millions of people, you can have a lot of genes floating around in a population of millions strong. But if you only started with 2 people, that restricts the diversity today. If the Bible's correct and Adam really is our ancestor, there should only be one male ancestor of humanity. And the mitochondrial DNA, the mtDNA, that's a little piece of DNA that's only inherited from your mother. All people get it from their mother. Well, that means we can build a family tree of all the females in the world, and there should only be one female ancestor of everyone on earth today. If evolution is true, that shouldn't be true, and none of those have to be true. But also, most genes should come in 2 versions, because Eve was taken from Adam. She probably got Adam's genome, except for the Y chromosome. But Adam only has 2 copies of each gene, so you can only have 2 versions of each gene. Turns out, this is exactly what we have found in modern human genetics.
Huh. Wow.
I mean, what's the chance of the Bible being made up and the biblical story actually mirrors what we actually see in human genetics today?
That's amazing.
Totally amazing.
Absolutely.
We look at Noah's flood. Noah's flood tells all people should be closely related. It tells us there should only be a few mitochondrial DNA lines. That's Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wives.
Right.
And only 1 Y chromosome, because it's only Noah. His 3 sons would have inherited his Y chromosome. Any other Y chromosome diversity before the flood is gone. And we should have evidence of rapid population growth. We saw that a minute ago. Turns out that this is exactly what we find in modern genetics. This is the Noah's flood story also.
1 Y and only a few of the lady's genes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It didn't have to be true. And in the Tower of Babel account, we have discovered a single dispersal of all people in the relatively recent past, traveling in small people groups into uninhabited territory through the Middle East. They call it the Out of Africa story. But these are all biblical predictions right here.
Single dispersal, all at one time, relatively recent past, traveling in small groups to uninhabited areas throughout the Middle East. That's exactly what happened.
Yes.
And they think it's a little further south in Africa. You think it's a little further north in.
The starting point is a little different,
Yeah.
but the same pattern is predicted
exactly.
by both sides.
And they're totally agreeing with you on that.
Yes, except they want it here as
Right.
far as the starting point goes.
Right.
But the Bible says this.
Yes.
Now, interestingly, I'm sure you've had people on your show talking about the biblical Ice Age.
Mm-hmm.
During that Ice Age, which was approximately the same time as the Tower of Babel,
Oh.
you could have walked from here to Ireland on dry ground.
Sure.
You could have walked to Tasmania.
Yeah.
And the only deep water part you have to cross is a place between these 2 little islands, Bali and Lombok, and you can see one island from the other. It's right there. It's not, and you could have walked all the way down to here on dry ground.
Huh.
At that one point in history, not any other point in history.
It all adds up.
It does. If we look at the evolutionary Out of Africa story, that's a Tower of Babel story right there.
Okay.
Now they want to push the origin way down deep in here, but that's actually bad. The graphic artist put it there. It should be up here because this is the greatest amount of diversity. But they put it there because they can't put it there. They could not put it there. And if we just look at the history of man and compare it to the evolutionary timeline and the biblical timeline. So they believe that about 1 million Homo erectuses lived in Africa and Asia for about 1 million years. And then something happened. Our population was reduced to, they say, an effective population size of about 10,000 people. That's called extinction. And there's about that many cheetahs in Africa today, and all the population biologists think they're going to go extinct, or a lot of them. They're worried about cheetahs. Well, somehow, during this catastrophic event, modern humans evolved. And then we spread out of Africa and covered the world. Well, the biblical timeline says we started with Adam and Eve a few thousand years ago, went to some unknown number before the flood, were reduced to 8 souls during Noah's flood, and then a couple hundred years later, we hit the Tower of Babel event when we spread out across the world. Do you know why the evolutionist has this dip right there?
No.
Because they're trying to explain how come all people across the world are so similar to one another. They didn't predict it from their timeline because this many people, 1 million people, you have a lot of genetic diversity in there.
So the genome is driving them back to a small number.
Yes, they were.
You have an explanation for it, they really don't.
Yeah, they were forced to do it because of the data. The Bible predicted that.
Yes.
That's really neat. Now let's take a step back. And let's look at some data from world populations. This is some data from a major multi-million-dollar study where they looked at genetic diversity amongst people across the world. And what I did is I pulled that data and I made this chart. And this is, allele frequency is how many people in the world have a particular gene. And so you can see there are some genes that are very rare and they're found in a lot of people. Some genes that are very common, found in a lot of people. And there's not so many genes in the middle. If we started with Adam and Eve, I suspect that just about all the genes would be at 50%, because Adam had each chromosome. That's, 1 plus 1 is, each one is 50%. How can we have this pattern if we expect that pattern? Well, I happen to have written a computer model to handle this also. And what this is I start with Adam and Eve, and here's their 50-50 genes right there in the background. And every 100 years, I save the pattern of genes in this population on the computer. And I ran it for 6,000 years, and right here, this plateau, that's Noah's flood, where I picked 8 people out of the population, 3 of them are brothers, and I reset it, and 100 years after the flood, genetic diversity drops. These wings right here, those are genes that are lost from the population. It's something original in Adam and Eve, but by the time you get to here, everyone in the world has that gene, or no one in the world has that gene. That's what those 2 wings are. Now, looking at this, look at this. Is this real? I mean, does that match this? And the answer is, yeah. This smile right here,
And that smile.
that's going to happen right there.
Ah, okay.
Now, this is a population of 1,000 people. If I did the population of 500 people, this gets flatter. There's all sorts of ways. In fact, if Noah and his family were all closely related to one another, I picked out random women from the population. What if they're sisters? That gets flatter. And so computer models, we're getting to the point where we're looking at this and this, and we're saying these are very similar things.
That's really fascinating. We need to take a break, and we'll come back and pick up right there. So don't you go away. We'll be right back. Back to Origins with Dr. Rob Carter. Now, it seems to me that your genetics fits perfectly with the numbers when we look to the past. How's the future look?
Oh, actually, the future doesn't look very good.
Uh-oh.
And there's several different ways we can spin this. First of all, you've got about 100 trillion cells in your body.
Okay.
Every single possible genetic mutation exists in you.
Every one.
Because every time your cells divide, they add more letter mistakes.
Yeah.
But happily, we don't pass on our skin cells, which have most of the mutations, to our children. But even in our reproductive cells, they also pick up mutations. And every child born has probably about 100 brand new mutations. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but that's really bad. Natural selection would have to remove them to prevent us from going extinct eventually. And so because of that, every possible genetic mutation is passed on into the next generation hundreds, if not thousands of times over. That's tremendously bad for a population. In fact, geneticists can't explain how a population can survive for long periods of time with that mutation rate. I wrote another paper with a dear friend of mine, John Sanford, and we were looking at the influenza genome. Now, the flu is under strong natural selection because it's at war with the human immune system. Mm-hmm. The only flus that get passed on are the ones that escape the human immune system. That's called natural selection. You got to get past a filter. And we looked at sequenced flu viruses all the way back to 1918. And we discovered this chart. What this is how many mutations are in the virus over time. And the straight line increase means that natural selection is not removing the mutations.
Oh.
Even though it's under natural selection is only preventing the accumulation of the ones that are really bad. But enough of them accumulate over time that the human H1N1 virus, the big one that killed so many people right after World War I,
right,
went extinct in 2009.
Oh, praise God.
Yeah. That virus could not withstand that number of mutations. Now, fast forward to the human population, we are not going to last for millions of years. And if we can't last for millions of years into the future, we could not have existed millions of years in the past.
So this has not just a dire warning for the future, it speaks to the fact that we aren't that old.
We can't be that old.
Can't be.
Now, granted, the flu virus has a higher mutation rate. But there's been enough generations and people that we can extrapolate at 100 mutations per person over time. We will not be here a million years hence.
So the millions and millions of years that the evolutionist wants for our development can't be given understanding mutations.
That's right.
Okay.
And even allowing for natural selection.
So
that is not their savior. So if we can summarize all these things that we've said.
Please.
It appears that all humans descend from one man and one woman. We call that Adam and Eve. We can conclude that the flood was not a genetic disaster. It wouldn't have led to the extinction of the population. It would have caused a flattening of the allele frequency distribution, but not extinction.
Okay.
We can see the Tower of Babel in our genes, and the way the genes are spread out around the world. I mean, screaming Tower of Babel. It's easy to get 7 billion people, and yet at the same time, mutations are driving us to extinction.
It lines up with the Bible perfectly.
Yes, it does.
It lines up with a young earth perfectly.
Yes, it does.
And genetics has brought a whole new dimension to this debate, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
And
Genetics has been able to, we've been able to confirm major biblical statements using genetics.
That's amazing. Folks, I hope that you've appreciated, as I have, Dr. Carter's work. I don't know how many times in there he said, we wrote a paper. And his research and study is fascinating. And the more he digs, the more he brings us back to the truth of Scripture. We see it in Adam and Eve. We see it in the flood. We see it in the Tower of Babel. We see it in history today. I hope that this confirms your faith. I hope you'll join us again soon here on Origins. Remember, it's God's view that He created you. That should be your view too. See you again soon here on Origins.
Okay, well, let's get into the chromosome 2 then.
Okay, so mitochondrial DNA, mitochondrial Eve lived thousands of years ago, is not evidence of an Adam and Eve in a garden created by God. It's not. It's an evidence that on our evolutionary past, something called the mitochondrial Eve, that they're just calling her that for name's sake, lived.
So what it is, it's a combination of evidence. So the Y chromosome variation, the mitochondrial DNA variation, the low genetic diversity, all of this in combination actually demonstrates that we came from not just a small founding population, but a population of just 2, which is exactly what we read about in Genesis in regards to the special creation of Adam and Eve. We only have a minute. I do want to touch on the chromosome 2 fusion, and I'll let you kind of have the last words there. What I said was that human chromosome number 2 that you're saying arose from 2 ape-like chromosomes. I was giving evidence that this so-called fusion site is actually a functional DNA element in a human gene and not actually the result of a fusion. And I talked about how, just one sec, and I talked about how the telomeres we know serve as end caps to protect the DNA, and one of their jobs is what? To prevent fusion. So therefore, this in combination with the other evidence,
do you accept that there are parallel genes on both chromosomes? That the genes our genetic material is 98% the same as chimpanzees.
No, it's more like 88%. But the thing is, a gene has been found, as I talked about, and it spans the entire fusion site. But genes are always found on one chromosome. So how can we have parts of it on both? And then they fuse together, and these parts are now together. It's just not realistic. And telomeres don't occur in the middle of genes. Genes are not around telomeres. So, I mean, I can go on and on and on as to why the human chromosome 2 is not actually the result of a fusion, which in and of itself makes the evolutionary prediction failed, and actually, once again, demonstrates special creation of human beings because, well, they're not related to chimps. They don't have ape ancestry is the point.
Evolution is wrong, therefore creation is not an argument, though. All you're doing is rebutting.
If there was no human chromosome 2 and there was no ancestry with apes, humans and apes, well, then where does that leave humans on the phylogenetic tree of life? Where does that leave them? Who are they related to? Are they related to apes? Are they related to dogs? If they're not related to apes, Adam, I want to ask you, where does humankind, are they a separate kind than all other life? If all this evidence suggests otherwise, how can you explain a separate kind called humankind that's not related to any other animal on the tree of life? Go ahead.
Programmers that created the simulation made it that way.
So some type of intelligent design, but not the God of the Bible.
Well, I'm just saying there are other hypotheses. Your argument is the standard evolutionary model is wrong, therefore creation has to be true. I'm saying no, there's this third option. We could say that we live in a simulation, and that's just the way the simulation programmers made it. Okay, why is your idea better than my idea?
That would be because my idea makes testable and falsifiable predictions. Briefly, if you can hear me there, Neff, we talked about chromosome 2, and I noticed you were really giving Drag there a run for his money. I mean, the guy was falling all over himself. I can't remember if it was CRISPR that came to the rescue as usual, or usually it's either CRISPR or Sam that comes to the rescue of these guys immutable and Drag. But human chromosome 2, right? They're saying that it arose through a fusion of two ape-like chromosomes. But we know that this, apparent fusion site is actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. Did you want to expand on that? One for Guzman. I know Guzman was exposed to that through some biblical compromiser named Robert from Sentinel Apologetics. The guy won't debate it.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to. Let me take a bathroom break. I'll be going about 1.5 minutes, and then I'll be happy to expound upon that. The argument that was made by the evolutionists in the hangout the other day were just their ideas from their head, things that they need to believe, but not actually scientific. And I'd love to talk about that for just a minute and explain why the real science gets denied by evolutionists because it doesn't comport with their evolution theory. Give me about 60 seconds.
Well, because if we actually look, and while he's gone, I'll fill in, Guzman. If we actually, look at recent reanalysis of the human chromosome 2, we know that it's now contradicted this evolutionary prediction, right? It kind of falls all in line with the junk DNA paradigm, and this junk DNA paradigm has certainly been overturned to the point that there's actually no significant evidence that this actual fusion exists. And what the facts are is that this alleged site, say where this fusion supposedly took place, actually represents a highly organized and functional gene. So if you actually start from the assumption of, say, human to ape common ancestry, it's evident now that evolutionists have actually made a failed prediction about the structure and function of DNA within our cells. So at the end of the day, a lot of their, strongest arguments, say for, in this case, ape to human common ancestry, it really has been overturned. And they'll fight it tooth and nails. They'll never give it up. There's too much at stake, as Superbad was indicating. I'm not sure if you heard any of that, Neff. I know you were.
No, I just came back about 15 seconds ago. So.
I was just talking about briefly how the human chromosome 2 is really just a failed evolutionary prediction because of the highly organized functional gene.
Yeah.
In the alleged site, right? Did you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yes. Yes, it's been discovered that there are 1,996 functional associations with biological entities spanning 7 categories that include molecular profile, organismal, chemical, functional term, phrase or reference, cell line, cell type or tissue. That cell type means cell specialization. Cells are given genetic information when they split sometimes that determines what kind of cell it's going to be. Is it going to be a pancreas cell? Is it going to be a heart muscle cell? And this is how an organism develops in their fetal development stage. As an organism develops, cells are specialized, and information in a given cell, when a cell splits, cells aren't produced just de novo in an organism. They're not just created. All cells in organisms come into being because a previous cell splits and doubles it splits the genome, and the cell splits into two cells, and each one gets a copy of the genetic material. That's how new cells form, not by a new cell being created, but by a cell splitting into two. So that's how cells are made. That's called, and when that happens during fetal development, like when your mother has you in your womb and you're developing over a period of 9 months, different cells specialize to become this kind of tissue, that kind. There's over 250 some odd tissues types in a human being. So a cell is given a specific genetic information twist during the cell division that tells that you're going to become this kind of cell. Instead of a brain cell, you're going to be an intestinal wall lining cell, or you're going to be a bladder cell, or you're going to be a nerve cell, or an artery cell, or a heart valve cell. That's called cell specialization. So these 1996 known functional associations of the genes that I'm about to explain include cell specialization, genes, proteins or mitochondrial RNA, I'm sorry, and they relate to 20 different data sets. Now, here's the thing. This imagined chromosome fusion site, evolutionists say, well, human beings and chimpanzees have during the evolution of mankind, the chromosomes fused, and that's why we find this profound evidence for evolution, because the difference in chromosomes between humans and chimps is explained by two chromosomes having fused in the history of man. Okay. Now, the problem is that science has discovered that, imagine in your mind, from the left to the right, we have a line going across your screen, okay? And you draw a line down the middle, a dot in the center of that line. And let's pretend that's the fusion site, okay? Now, to the left of it is the human chromosome. To the right is another human chromosome, and they fuse together, right? So now, in the dot in the center is where they fused. And that's what evolutionists claim is evidence that humans and chimps are related. But here's the major problem with that. There are genes that span all the way across that dot in the center. Gene sets, not just a gene, numerous genes that cross over that fusion site, that dot in the middle. And they have all these different types of functions, 7 categories: molecular profile, organism, chemical, functional term, phrase or in reference, cell line, cell tissue, protein, mitochondrial RNAs. All these types of the information in the genes that span across that dot, that fusion site, supposed fusion site, relate to these different categories of critical function in a human being. Now, it gets really deep. Kind of try to stay with what I'm about to say. I want people who know nothing about what I'm saying to understand, because there are people who say, man, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. And it's not that I'm so smart or that I'm telling you stuff that's really complex. It's just that once people get engrossed in this kind of thing, they tend to use terms that some people who have never encountered any debate about evolution or creation, they don't know what they mean. So they don't know what the heck you're talking about. I want to make it simple so everybody can understand the failure of the evolutionist claim that this is a fusion site. Okay. So the dot in the center is where these two chromosomes, these two giant bundles of genetic information, came together and merged, and they became fixed and stuck to each other, and they're permanent. Now they're forevermore together. Okay. But the problem with that is that there are many complex genes that read, if you read them left to right, like you're going to read a sentence in a book, I'm going to start to the left and the words go on to all the way to the right until you find the period all the way on the right side, right? The problem is that sentence goes across the dot, the supposed site where the two chromosomes fused. You see what I mean? Who wrote the sentence that goes all the way across the spot where there was supposedly two entirely different and related books that were snapped together? How is that possible? How do you have a coherent sentence? Not only does the sentence, is it a coherent one, but it relates to functions that are critical for the book on the left and the book on the right to even exist. Else, they couldn't function. And some of these functions are, one of them is that these codes, these genes, and this set of genes is called DDX11L2. And it produces, one of the things that it produces is what's called helicase. Now, helicase is a really complex set of molecular machinery stuck together that produces a single machine. And that machine duplicates the DNA molecule in your cells. In other words, the DNA, this machine, it's really complex, made of proteins and numerous components, latches onto the DNA and it starts to duplicate it, to make a copy, because you have to have the duplication of the DNA molecule going on in the cells or you don't you can't survive. The DNA has to be duplicated. And it's duplicated constantly. In your body right at this moment, there are probably hundreds of thousands of DNA molecules that are being duplicated by this quote-unquote helicase machinery at this second. It's constant. Okay, so this machine is, let's imagine an automobile engine. Okay, so let's imagine that one component in that automobile engine is its heads. That is the block of the heads with the valve train in it, in an overhead cam valve engine. You've got the camshaft, you've got the valve springs, you got the rockers, you've got the valve springs, you got the valve guides, you got the valve stems themselves. All that is one component of the engine, and the other is a block, and then another component is the crankshaft. And then another component, let's imagine that if we could liken all the piston rods with the pistons and piston rings connected is a separate component. All the pistons and the churning component inside the engine. Okay, that's another unit. Okay, that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about helicase. It's numerous complex molecules arranged in a specific manner so that each one has functions, and then they are different ones are put together to comprise a much bigger component, like the heads and the block and the crankshaft with the piston rings and everything, connecting rods and pistons and piston rings are all a separate unit, put together make an engine in your car. So these helicase machines combined together create the helicase machine, and it duplicates the DNA molecule. It's critical to the function of your life. If it didn't exist, you would not exist. And it spans the dot in the middle of the page. In other words, it starts on the left and it ends on the right. It goes across the dot. Now, if the dot represents the spot where one chromosome on the left and one chromosome on the right came together and fused, these genes with all these different functions, and one of them it being that it produces this macro collective, outrageously complex collection of molecular machines that could together produce a machine called helicase that duplicates the DNA molecule, then it's not plausible that part of the DNA, the helicase, or any of these other functions like cell specialization, that information on one side, information on another, happen to block together, and then boom, we get the processes. That's not plausible. That's out. Can't believe that. Therefore, if this was actually a fusion site, here's what would have had to have happened. The genes that create the helicase and the other functions that are important for cell specialization and whatnot had to have been made so that they span across that fusion site after the fusion took place. And that would have had to have happened by random genetic mutation. And in our last hangout, I asked CRISPR and a couple other people, what's the reason for believing that? And Dragnock Silvas simply refused to answer my question. Their response to me was, well, Nephi, when you understand enough about science for me to talk to you, give me a call. That's the kind of response that we got out of them, instead of an actual scientific response.
And then meanwhile, we asked Drag for hours to come on and have a simple discussion with you. I mean, at least we'll give CRISPR credit. You know, he certainly talked with you for, extended amount of time. But that Drag, he must have meth nightmares.
Well, I mean, instead of answering the question or talking about it intellectually, we get these ridiculous hand-waving, well, I can't respond. Obviously, they can't respond against the real science with their philosophy. So the way to fix the problem for them is to prevent, because they can't answer, they got to have a tool to explain why they can't answer. Like, Nephi, when you understand cell mutation, let me know. This is their way of dealing with it. They can't deal with it, so they come up with these childish responses. So here's the thing, that these genes span the supposed fusion site. They have critical functions for the existence of the organism. CRISPR actually told me they're non-functional. That was his way of responding to the evidence, that they're non-functional. The problem is that these functions are listed in a genetic database as functional. So what he's doing there is saying, science isn't true. What I believe and what I tell you is true. I don't care that they're documented as having function and they're recorded in genetic databases as being functional. I'm telling you, they're not functional. So what we've got is the belief system of the evolutionist turned into supposed science, which refutes actual, observable, tested, repeated, documented science.
Well, it's just like, the apparent pseudo gene that evolutionists like to harp on or to promote. Supposedly this remain of a gene devoted to egg yolk production that's apparently in our DNA in exactly the same place that evolution would predict. But just like many other, specific genetic markers, specific pseudogenes, chromosome 2, we know that this recent research has actually exposed this as nearly impossible to reconcile with the actual facts.
Completely
impossible. Fight it,
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, this supposed evidence, say for the egg yolk gene, it's so pathetic, it's so sad that it's hard to imagine that anyone could have actually entertained this, hypothesis.
Yeah, they shouldn't, because the germ lines that produce different features in one organism and another don't line up with that egg germline cell thing. That idea was discredited. In fact, over 100 years ago, even almost before they even understood what DNA really did, that idea was already refuted.
Well,
let me finish about what I was saying briefly, if you don't mind. The supposed fusion site is spanned by critical genes that produce machinery that's critical to the function of the organism, and cell specialization information overlapping in a nested information that does wonderful 7 different categories of critically important information in the human cell and organism. Okay, but now, as I pointed out, those those overlapping and nested genes that span the supposed fusion site would have had to have been produced by evolution, by mutation and natural selection after the fusion, because they're there, right? So, but the problem for that is that science doesn't document any reason for believing that random genetic mutations can build genetic information, that it can create overlapping and nested information, which requires the sharing of base pairs between one sequence of information, quote unquote gene, and another sequence of information, quote unquote gene. We have no scientific reason to believe that malarkey at all. All we observe is mutations destroy. But evolutionists, in their wild, crazy, mythological, religiously ardent, and fervent belief system, believe that mutations can do this kind of ridiculous thing. That mutations are going to design, and mutation would have had to have designed all those overlapping and nested genes in that DD11 XL site in order for that to have happened after the supposed fusion of these 2 chromosomes. But there is nothing in science, not one thing, that makes anybody believe there is a scientific basis in believing that random genetic mutation can, 1, create information, 2, it can create overlapping and nested information, whereas information that in one sequence shares base pairs with another sequence of information that spans even a greater length, perhaps, than it is, wider to the
If you
left
don't
and the
mind me
right.
cutting out there real quick, and it seems like, because in the chat, CRISPR, it seems like if you put it all in a nutshell, he's just saying, and I imagine many other evolutionary scientists, well, there's no actual evidence for function.
Yeah, but it's already in genetic databases as functional.
Yeah.
So he's denying science right there.
Would you say a lot of them are science deniers?
All evolutionists are science denialists. When you show them science and it contradicts their philosophy, they'll deny the science to hold to their philosophy.
I think based on their arguments, whether it's spurious transcription or, there's function, but it's not a useful activity, I think they're just missing the bigger picture and the actual point, Neff, because first off, preliminary biochemical evidence for function does not exist merely, say, for, the examples of pseudogenes that we were talking about. It actually exists for at least 80% of all pseudogenes in humans. And then the other 20% may actually still yet to be found,
Yeah.
functional in some human tissue or under some physiological condition yet to be studied. And there are many. So really, it all comes down to the fact that many non-coding RNA genes, say like these pseudogenes, are only expressed under certain conditions. And then we get into the whole embryonic, placental type functions. I mean, junk DNA really is dead, but why do they have to hold on to it so strongly?
Well, they do. But listen, here's an interesting thing, too, also. CRISPR said that they're not functional. Science demonstrates they are. They've already been documented in a database, a genetic database that says they are. But let's pretend for a second that his claim, although already fallacious, were true. That these genes, although they do code for helicase and other things, are not functional. Let's say they're there, but they're never used by the DNA. Let's pretend that were true, but it's not. But that's what CRISPR said. Let's pretend that's true. That still doesn't explain the existence of them. You're still wanting us to believe that random genetic mutation, then after the fusion site, listen to the insanity of this now. Listen carefully. CRISPR is still expecting us to believe that random, unguided, undirected molecular interactions will create the genetic information that just so happens to mirror exactly the same genes that code for the helicase, the outrageously complex helicase machine for a gene that's found somewhere else in the genome exactly like it, and create that after the fusion site. And it's going to do, random mutations are going to do that after the fusion site. They're going to build the same genes that create the functional helicase machinery. I mean, what in the world could possibly make that rational? Now, the only explanation that he could come forth with after this is, and he never got to this, but this is where I would have to take him if I questioned him and pummeled him with science. He would have to come to this. Well, it's a duplicate mutation. Uh, uh, Genetic information over here was copied and inserted and rewritten over the base pairs that span the fusion site, rewritten over it. Okay, but when that kind of thing happens in genomic information, it doesn't happen by rewriting an entire set of base pairs. It happens by copy and paste, an intelligent design process, just like you do with Microsoft Windows. You copy and paste things. That can happen. That is a real genetic process. Information can be copied by the genome using algorithms, or go way over here to the other side of the DNA in a new location and cut the DNA molecule, paste that snippet of information in, fuse it, and connect the ends again. And now you've got a new chunk of DNA in there that was copied from one place and pasted into it on the other. Nobody knows of any genetic process where information is copied on one place and then machinery connects to the DNA and overwrites all the information that's present to rewrite that as something else to create the helicase. It's not known to science. That does not happen genetically. So that's the only place somebody like CRISPR could have gone, is to say that the reason we find these specialized genes that, like, for example, the ones that code for helicase that span the fusion site, is because information was copied from one place in the genome and then it rewrote all the base pairs across the fusion site to make those genes. That is not a genetic process. That doesn't happen in DNA. Insert, copy, and paste into, move the information down some, and snap a new piece in, that happens. Copy and rewrite a whole section of genetic information for new genes doesn't happen. What that would also do is completely destroy all the genetic information that it copied over. That's just not a process in the DNA. So again, the evolutionists, when you ask them these kinds of things and show them this kind of evidence, they have to continuously, with their rebuttals, with their attempt to respond, continuously back themselves into a corner, to a smaller corner, to a smaller corner, to a smaller corner, to a smaller corner, each one being scientifically false, to a point where what the ultimate answer that they have to give to explain, for example, these genes, like the one that codes for helicase, spanning the fusion site, is something that's so utterly absurd and obviously scientifically false that everything that they've said from the beginning about the subject was just their ideas in their head and not science. So the fusion site cannot be a fusion site. In summary, let me sum it up really quick. In summary, it can't be a fusion site because the place where these chromosomes supposedly join together, what spans across that fusion site, just like a bridge going across a river, is numerous genes that have 7 different categories of critically important function to an organism, that one of which is the codes for the machinery, very complex machinery that duplicates the DNA molecule. You ought to see a video of that, how that operates on the internet. It'll blow your mind. The machinery. Look for that. It'll blow your mind. That machinery is coded across this fusion site, and it's not something copied and pasted in, and it can't be something that was copied and rewritten over, because that doesn't happen, except in the immune system to make an enzyme. That's it. That's the only copy and rewrite new stuff. It's the enzymes that do that. That's the immune system. Okay. So the idea that it's a fusion site is not plausible. And the arguments put forth by people like CRISPR and others that try to explain this away can be backed down by asking one question after another to demonstrate it's not only scientifically implausible, it's utterly absurd. And science kills that idea. because of one thing, and then I'm done. Sequences of information that code for special human, critically important functions in a human being, including the machinery that duplicates the DNA molecule, spans all the way across that supposed fusion site. And that can't have been created before or after a supposed fusion, because there's no genetic mechanism for that. It just gets that simple. It can't be true.
No, I find it funny because if you look at a lot of their, purported evidence, we now know human chromosome 2. Well, you know what? That site is actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. These pseudogenes, the fact that they say humans and chimpanzees share genetic mistakes, aka pseudogenes. We now know these pseudogenes appear to be functional DNA elements, not actually mistakes. What's another one that they use that has failed? Even the fact that, they say human to chimpanzee genetic identity is 98 to 99% similar. But now, based on the data, genetic identity is only 88% similar. And to put that into perspective, that's over 400 million DNA differences that actually exist between the two species. So, I mean, how do they reconcile that all their, major evidence for Pons come to people evolution is just falling apart bit by bit?
It's